We're very honored to have two of our co-chairs of the Ukraine caucus, and we'll give the podium to them. Congressman Andy Harris from Maryland.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nadia, for the introduction. It's a pleasure as one of the co-chairs of the Ukrainian caucus to bring people together at this very appropriate time to discuss where the United States, how the United States should go forward in making sure that we protect the independence of Ukraine. Clearly, we have watched over the last few years the continuation of Russian aggression on the eastern border of Ukraine, and it is time, I believe, and I think what we'll hear today are some of the suggestions. It's time for the U.S. to step up its activity to actually enhance the defensive capabilities of Ukraine, and to make certain that Russian aggression and separatist aggression in the eastern part of the country is contained, and that I think we should begin negotiations on an international basis about the future of Crimea and restoring the integrities of the Ukraine borders as outlined in the Budapest Memorandum. It's high time that the new administration take a new pathway forward, and I look forward to hearing from the recommendations of this group. And I will next turn it over to my colleague, Representative Fitzpatrick, one of the other co-chairs of the caucus.
Good morning, everybody, and it's a pleasure to be here today. And I had the pleasure of joining the ambassador last night for to celebrate the 26th anniversary of Ukrainian independence. This is a really important topic, not only as co-chair of the Ukrainian caucus, but also as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee. It's something that we've dealt with frequently, the issue of Russian sanctions, stepping them up, but also getting more bipartisan support, and both sides have work to do on this to make it an overwhelming majority of the U.S. House of Representatives that stand in solidarity with Ukraine. I have a very special connection to the country. In addition to being the co-chair, my last FBI assignment, I was an FBI agent before coming to Congress. My last international assignment was in Kyiv. And I was assigned there along with a number of folks from the international intelligence community to, at that point, set up the National Anti-Corruption Bureau in Kiev, led by a gentleman named Artem Sidnik. I hope to get back over there and check on their progress, but what was abundantly clear to me is that the Ukrainian people desperately need our help. They desperately want their independence. And I was as troubled as anybody to see the Russian aggression that essentially went unchecked and unanswered, annexing the entire Crimean region, continuing their invasion in the east, in the Donetsk region, in Donbass. And one thing that I think the Ukrainian caucus stands for is to make sure that Ukraine has a voice here in the United States House of Representatives, because Russian aggression is not just a threat to Ukraine, it's a threat to the entire region, it's a threat to the entire world, including here in the United States, as we've seen. So I'm just really proud to be a part of the caucus. I am on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and where your organization comes in is to keep us informed and educated, because while we're responsible for dealing with a whole host of issues on the Foreign Affairs Committee, to include North Korea and Iran and many other pressing matters, you folks are dealing with this day in and day out. You have your ear to the ground. You have up-to-date information and intelligence, and the more frequently you can share that with us, me and my members, my fellow caucus members, and members of the committee. Believe me, it is very appreciated, because we're asking you to do that. So thank you for inviting us today. Thank you.
I want to thank the co-chairs for coming, because this is an incredibly busy time for them, and they have many pressures. So their coming here signifies how much, what importance they put to all this. I do want to thank the caucus for sponsoring this briefing. An independent democratic Ukraine is not only in the best national interest of the United States and the rest of the free world, but helping secure that independence is a fiduciary duty and a moral responsibility of the United States. Former Defense Secretary William J. Perry and former Secretary of State George Shultz wrote in 2014, and I quote, "Helping Ukraine is a U.S. imperative. A good relationship with Russia is important, but not if it can break solemn promises with impunity. Further, Mr. Perry participated in negotiations leading to the Budapest Memorandum and can testify to the seriousness of the broken promise. He can also testify that both the Russian and American negotiators understood that this memorandum was critical to Ukraine's decision to give up its 2,000 nuclear weapons, unquote. In 1857, Taras Shevchenko wrote, "When will Ukraine have its Washington with fair and just laws? Contrary to the lies, fake news, ongoing propaganda emanating from the Kremlin and their proxy spokesmen in the West, time and again the people of Ukraine have demonstrated for and continue to sacrifice for their choice of democracy and independence. Most recently, the people of Ukraine arose spontaneously on the Maidan and protested, fought and died to uphold and nurture their pro-European aspirations and values." As George Weigel wrote, the end of last year, forming the habits of mind and hearts that will turn the Maidan revolution into a stable and prosperous democracy is what today's civil society initiatives are doing in Ukraine. It's the kind of bottom-up civic renewal that demands the respect and support of the entire West. Reforms are taking hold. Corruption is being dismantled. This is not the time to abandon civil society in its fight against corruption. Ukraine's battle for its freedom and our common Euro-Atlantic values continue daily. We must allow the people of Ukraine to defend themselves. The victims of Putin's war grow daily. They deserve our help. In conclusion, I want to thank the various members of the Friends of Ukraine Network who participated in the 4 task forces, especially the ones that served on the National Security Task Force, because they had a particularly unique assignment. They developed those recommendations in March and have continued to this day to advocate for them within Congress, the administration, and in the general public arena. Thank you. We are grateful to all of them for their work and their input. Thank you. And now I'll turn it over to Orest Tukiewski, our colleague and friend, to moderate the briefing.
I'm very pleased to welcome our distinguished speakers, each of whom are representatives of at least one, if not more, of the 4 Friends of Ukraine Network task forces. They'll offer insights based on policy recommendations that each of the task forces developed for priorities for U.S. assistance. Broadly speaking, these policy recommendations demonstrate that the U.S. continues to stand with the people of Ukraine, allowing the people of Ukraine to better defend themselves, helping the victims of Putin's war, and supporting civil society's fight to strengthen reforms, including to combat corruption. Our speakers are acknowledged experts with vast experience. They'll each offer brief remarks, and then afterwards we'll move on to Q&A. I could spend a long time going through their impressive resumes, but in the interests of time, I'll just touch upon some highlights, and I will introduce them in the order in which they will speak. First, representing the National Security Task Force, Ambassador Alexander Sandy Vershbow is Distinguished Fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security. For 4 years until October 2016, he was Deputy Secretary General of NATO. Prior to that, he held numerous senior positions in Washington, including as U.S. Ambassador to NATO, Ambassador to Russia, and Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Mike Carpenter is Senior Director at the Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement at the University of Pennsylvania. He's former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, whose responsibilities included Russia and Ukraine. And before that, he served in the White House as Foreign Policy Coordinator for Vice President Biden and was a Director for Russia at the NSC. Moving on, representing the Economy and Energy Task Force is one of its co-chairs, Ambassador Roman Popadyuk. Roman held many positions at the State Department NSC in the Reagan and George H.W. Bush administrations and was the first U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He's held a variety of positions since then, including Executive Director of the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation at Texas A&M. and chairman of the board of the World Affairs Council of America. Moving on to the Humanitarian Task Force, we have two representatives from there, the two co-chairs. Dawn Calabia serves as senior advisor at Refugees International, where she's worked since 2004. Her previous positions included 10 years with the UN, including acting director at the UN Information Center in Washington, and with the High Commissioner on Refugees. Also, she worked at the U.S. Catholic Conference and on the staff of the House International Relations Committee, or House Foreign Affairs Committee, as it's known now. Then Jonathan Katz is senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, former deputy assistant administrator for Europe and Eurasia at USAID during much of the previous administration, the Obama administration. He's held senior positions at state also, and also served on the House Foreign Affairs Committee. And last but not least, representing the Democracy and Civil Society Task Force, Ambassador Cliff Bond was most recently acting coordinator for U.S. assistance to Eastern Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia at the State Department. Prior to that, he was U.S. assistance coordinator at Embassy Kyiv from April 2014, right after the war began, to September 2015, so an especially critical period of time. He also held many positions at the State Department, where he was a Foreign Service officer, including serving as U.S. Ambassador to Bosnia. So with that, let me turn it over to Ambassador Vershbow.
Thanks very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here with my colleagues to present the recommendations of the National Security Task Force. As you all know, it's been more than almost 4 years since Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea and the launch of its undeclared war in eastern Ukraine. And while many other crises dominate the headlines these days, Russian aggression remains one of the most serious threats facing the United States and its allies, and it's the main obstacle to any improved relationship with Russia. Through its aggression against Ukraine, Russia has torn up not only the Budapest Memorandum, but the entire international rule book. It's trying to undo decades of progress toward a Europe whole, free, and at peace, a goal supported by Republicans and Democrats across many administrations. Russia wants to go back to the days of a divided Europe, when it dominated its neighbors through force and coercion and denied them freedom to choose, in the case of Ukraine, a European future. As we've seen in Ukraine, today's Russia uses both military force and hybrid methods, such as cyber attacks and disinformation, to impose its will and to undermine other societies, including our own. If the Russians aren't stopped in Ukraine, they may be tempted to use the same methods against our NATO allies, such as the Baltic states and Poland. And other aggressive regimes, like China, might also be emboldened to seek to settle territorial claims by force. So the stakes remain very high, not just for Ukraine's survival as an independent democratic state, but for our own security and that of our allies. In fact, the future of an international order based on the rule of law rather than the law of the jungle is very much on the line in Ukraine. Ukraine's armed forces, after initial setbacks in 2014, have fought courageously and at significant human cost to contain the conflict in eastern Ukraine and to deter renewed Russian offensives. And they've benefited from some forms of assistance from the United States, Canada, and a few other allies, but they've been largely fighting on their own. Russia, meanwhile, provides state-of-the-art equipment in huge numbers to the so-called separatists, and its proxies, the Russians themselves and their proxies have never honored their obligations under the 2014 and 2015 Minsk agreements, first and foremost to ensure a lasting ceasefire and withdrawal of heavy weapons from the occupied territories. While the overall situation remains stalemated, Russian-led forces continue to launch artillery and rocket attacks with virtual impunity almost every day, inflicting substantial military and civilian casualties. And as a result, the basic security conditions for an end to the occupation, for the return of refugees, for elections, and the reintegration of the occupied territories under full Ukrainian sovereignty are still lacking. Now, meanwhile, the occupied territories are subject to brutal repression by the separatist leaders and are being more and more de facto integrated into the Russian economy. And What's more, there's even rising evidence that the Russians are behind a spate of terrorist bombings inside Ukraine and in Kiev itself, using operatives trained in the occupied Donbass. And diplomatic efforts remain deadlocked. I welcome the decision of the Trump administration to appoint a very experienced U.S. diplomat, Kurt Volker, as special representative for the Ukraine negotiations. But the prospects for a negotiated solution remain very uncertain. Moscow seems intent on keeping the situation at a low boil in the hopes that an endless, low-level conflict will eventually destabilize Ukraine, topple the regime of President Poroshenko, and bring to power leaders who will give up the Ukrainian people's dream of becoming closer to Europe and the transatlantic community. So the challenge is how to change President Putin's calculus and convince him to negotiate in good faith in implementing the Minsk agreements. Or put differently, how can we generate the leverage to strengthen the hand of the negotiators and induce Moscow to get out of the Donbass so that it can be reintegrated under Ukrainian sovereignty? So the Congress has provided some of the leverage that we need with the recent sanctions bill. It's now clear to Moscow that there'll be no lowering of the bar, no shortcut to an easing of the sanctions without congressional approval. And I hope the House Ukraine caucus will be clear that it would support a lifting of sanctions, but only when conditions for which they were imposed have been met. But the sanctions will not be enough. I strongly urge this caucus to come out now in support of expanding U.S. security assistance to Ukraine to include a lifting of the previous administration's embargo on lethal defensive weapons. The aim isn't to encourage Ukraine to seek a military victory, which I think Kiev knows is impossible. Rather, the purpose of providing defensive weapons is to help Ukraine deter the Russians from carrying out further attacks and to increase the pressure on Russia to negotiate seriously on implementing the Minsk agreements. The recommendations of our task force provide a list of priority areas for assistance, some of them lethal, some non-lethal, and Mike Carpenter can explain in greater detail what's in the package and the rationale behind it. But I think the capabilities we propose would help level the playing field by enabling the Ukrainians to better defend themselves and give them the means to hold Russian separatist forces accountable if they refuse to refrain from the unending artillery and rocket attacks. Now, will this package, if implemented, alter Putin's calculus? We can't be sure. But it may not be a coincidence that President Putin floated his recent proposal of a peacekeeping force just weeks after Secretary Mattis and Ambassador Volker talked up the possibility of lethal defensive weapons during their August 24 visit to Ukraine. And even if increasing security assistance doesn't change Putin's calculus, it will make it harder for him to keep destabilizing Ukraine and will serve as a warning to him that aggression elsewhere would meet a stronger Western response. So it would serve as a deterrent. One last point that's part of our package is that another way to send a message to Moscow would be to persuade the administration to grant Ukraine major non-NATO ally status. MNNA status would make it easier to provide Ukraine certain forms of equipment and advanced training, and it would serve as a symbolic demonstration of U.S. support for an independent Ukraine. Thanks.
One of the 4 co-chairs of the Ukraine caucus that is sponsoring this briefing, Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur. Thank you for coming.
Good morning. Freedom lovers all, it's a pleasure to be here with you this morning on behalf of the Ukrainian caucus in the House, and I know that Congressman Fitzpatrick, Congressman Harris, and Congressman Levin probably either have been here or will be here. And I obviously am very pleased to be one of the colleagues here in the House that supports all of you in your efforts to help Ukraine continue to move forward in this 21st century toward a land that is prosperous and free. It is under enormous distress at the moment because of Russia's invasion. We know, and I'm sure it has been discussed here this morning, over 10,000 Ukrainians have lost their lives. We have over 2 million displaced persons and over 20,000 wounded. And one of the questions I have in my mind is, as a free world, are we properly positioned to deal with those medical casualties and losses in Ukraine? What more can we do? We appreciate the work of all of the panelists who are here this morning and others who have helped them to help focus attention on the type of assistance that continues to be needed in the very vital nation of Ukraine. It is my great pleasure today to introduce someone who will have to return to Ukraine today and who has been meeting with members of Congress, members of the administration, brought to us by the Ukrainian ambassador, Shali, who also we warmly welcome back here to the Capitol, and to talk about Ukraine's future. I must say this to the panel because of my own deep and abiding interest in Ukraine. If we look at, from an economic standpoint, what is holding Ukraine's balance of payments in the positive side of the ledger, you would have to look at the field of agriculture. And though that is not the purpose of today's meeting, nonetheless, I think it's important for Americans and world citizens from all walks of life to think about that extraordinarily important sector in Ukraine. Despite Russia's invasion, despite all of the market pressures and so forth, to look at this sector as one that is keeping the nation afloat. The nation has challenges in the energy sector. She has challenges on the health front, obviously a major invasion on the eastern side, and yet this sector continues to hold Ukraine aloft from an economic standpoint. I continue to believe that the further development in this sector linked to global partners in agriculture to help advance it more quickly and to diversify its product line and to recognize Ukraine, in my opinion, as the largest organic sector in the world, largely undeveloped. What a powerhouse this nation represents for this new century. So we welcome the new Vice Prime Minister, and welcome Ivana Klimpush-Tsindzadze to us. What an incredible human being she is. Speaking at least 5 or 6 languages, some knowledge of the United States, having spent time here, very, very pivotal position. And I have to say, as a woman, someone who's able to bridge gender, ethnicity, race, language with such facility. I'm just truly impressed in meeting her and seeing Ukraine's potential being fully met internationally. We welcome you, Vice Minister, into our midst, and we thank the organizers of this conference so very much today for keeping Ukraine centerfold in what happens here in the Congress of the United States. You remind us who we are as Americans, and as I remind every audience I speak to coming here to the Capitol, the statue that sits atop the Capitol is the Statue of Freedom, and she is a woman. Thank you so very much, Vice Minister, for joining us today. Please address us. She has to catch a plane, and so we want to give her every moment possible here. Thank you so much.
I am really happy to recognize here today lots of Ukrainian friends that have gathered in order to draw attention of the policymakers in the U.S. on all levels to the needs of the Ukrainian people and to draw the attention to the contact that we have between the Ukrainian and American people that can be built on and can be further carried out. I'd like to especially praise the effort of the Friends of Ukraine Network, who have devoted their time and effort and expertise and knowledge to produce priority recommendations for U.S. assistance report to articulate those most important issues that would be critical to support in Ukraine. So thank you very much for your work, and my special thanks goes to the host, to the Yes Ukraine Foundation, that has been in place doing very important work with Ukraine, for Ukraine here in the U.S. For many years, basically decades. I also would like to take the opportunity to especially thank you, Congresswoman, for your engagement, interest, passion articulation of the and understanding of the needs of freedom fighters back in Ukraine, freedom fighters for freedom not only of Ukraine but basically for the whole Europe and civilized world, while holding the line against aggression of the Russian Federation. What we're trying to do right now, we're trying to combine our efforts to defend our land and at the same time to progress, to develop, to modernize, to upgrade pretty rotten procedures that we've inherited from the Soviet times that have not been really repaired or changed over the decades since Ukraine has regained independence. Being in this chamber of the U.S. Capitol, I believe I should really highlight many of the accomplishments that have become possible because of the engagement, because of the support of the United States in Ukraine, and that is corresponding to really many areas in our transformation of many areas in our country, and that has become possible first and foremost also because of efforts of practically all members of the Senate and House of Representatives, as well as those productive endeavors that all the Ukraine's caucuses have been making over this year. So thank you very much. I also would like to highlight the strong position of the U.S. administration in support of Ukraine. In the last 9 months, we have witnessed an intensification of the dialogue on different levels, including the highest level between Ukraine and the United States. And this dialogue is resulting right now in very concrete steps, in very practical projects in different spheres, starting from increasing Ukraine's defense capacity, boosting economic cooperation, and strengthening Ukraine's energy security, which all are part of the national interest and national security in a wider sense. We do count on the U.S. continued support for Ukraine and continued pressure on Kremlin to comply in full with the provisions of the international law, to implement Minsk agreements in their entirety, and seize Kremlin's illegal attempts to occupy Crimea. The U.S. leadership in driving this transatlantic unity for actually over these years since 2014 is probably was probably successful in undermining the Kremlin's calculus. And this unity and this leadership really is something that has to be further carried on, and dependent on this leadership, we will be able to regain our territorial integrity and regain our sovereignty over the land, and use all of our efforts in order to bring the well-being of our people to a better stage. So we are very grateful for the latest Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act that has been passed in the Congress, that has been signed by President Trump, and we are happy that this bipartisan spirit of solidarity with the people of Ukraine continues to prevail in the U.S. Congress today, and we hope that this will be carried further. And we are taking also positive note that both chambers share the importance of not just maintaining but also increasing the security and defense assistance to the Ukrainian military, as well as passing legislation that promotes the efforts of the Ukrainian government to implement deep and comprehensive reforms. So we are very much welcoming all the legislative initiatives that are on the table to increase and extend the security and defense assistance to Ukraine for the financial year of 2018. We hope that could be reached indeed a bigger number for Ukraine in the financial year 2018 budget would if passed, would emphasize the increasing dynamics of the U.S. support and send across a powerful message internationally. And this message could be further augmented by a decision of the United States to actually finally take this long-expected, long-awaited decision to provide Ukraine with assistance in the form of lethal weapons of the defensive nature. Regrettably, as you may know, many Ukrainian soldiers have been severely wounded in the conflict, so we do hope that we will continue our cooperation on rehabilitation of the Ukrainian soldiers and also building the medical capabilities in Ukraine, as well as helping them here in the U.S. when needed. We also appreciate the fact that the Senate and House versions of the draft fiscal year 2018 State and Foreign Operations Bill, the main lines of assistance for Ukraine have been preserved. So we hope that that will stay also till the time the appropriations will come in. Given the wide scope of challenges which are faced by Ukraine because of the Russian aggression, we hope that Ukraine receives assistance under fiscal year 2018 budget for State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development at levels equal to or exceeding the appropriations made in the previous years. And that is extremely important. You know, back, just on a personal note, back after the Orange Revolution, somehow all our foreign partners decided that civil society in Ukraine has matured and does not require any assistance and any support anymore, that they can manage it by themselves. We do really have, after the Revolution of Dignity, have a very vibrant, very active, very engaged civil society. But it still needs support, it still needs engagement from our partners from the U.S. So we do count on the solidarity, expertise, and unwavering support of the American people to our noble cause. And thank you very much for being here, for taking interest in Ukraine, and for spending your talent to help Ukraine. I'm sure this is in the national interest of the U.S. and of the of my country as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that concise yet very comprehensive statement. We needed to hear what you had to say. Thank you very much. Now we'll continue with our National Security Task Force with Mike Carpenter. Please, Mike.
I will proceed with where we left off. Ambassador Vershbow set the strategic stage for what we seek to accomplish in Ukraine, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about how the provision of defensive weapons to Ukraine fits into that larger strategic picture. Let me start with the strategic goal that we have in mind, which is to deny Russia the ability to suborn Ukraine and to bolster Ukraine's resilience and capabilities to survive and thrive as a sovereign state, particularly in the face of Russian aggression. The Kremlin uses three tactics to keep Ukraine subordinated to Russian influence. First, they are keeping the military situation in the Donbass unsettled, as you referred to, Sandy, at a low boil. Because this weakens the government politically, it drains it economically, and it leaves open the option for the Kremlin to relaunch significant military operations. Secondly, and increasingly, the Kremlin has resorted to what we call gray zone operations within the part of Ukraine controlled by the government. And by these, I mean assassinations, sabotage, cyber operations, and other types of activities designed to destabilize those parts of Ukraine that, as I said, are controlled by the government. Third, Russia uses economic sanctions and dirty money to try to subvert Ukraine's political class, particularly in advance of, during, and then after the next parliamentary elections. So strengthening Ukraine's sovereignty requires pushing back on all three of these, but right now I'm going to focus primarily on the military piece. So what we need to do is very clear. We need to end what has become a de facto arms embargo on Ukraine and increase the costs to Russia of its escalation. All of my previous discussions when I was in the Pentagon with Generals Breedlove, Hodges, Abizaid, and others focused on the distinction between defensive and offensive capabilities. The distinction between lethal and non-lethal confuses the issue because for military people, non-lethal equipment is designed to increase lethality. It's a useless distinction. The distinction that we use in the Pentagon is between offensive and defensive capabilities, and those that are used to support operations of either an offensive or defensive nature. Defensive capabilities like man-portable anti-tank weapons would increase the costs of offensive action by Russia, but they are not the weapon of choice for helping Ukraine to seize back additional terrain. So we propose giving Ukraine anti-tank missiles, UAVs, counter-battery radars, Humvees, and MRAPs, and I would add to that list fast patrol boats because Russia has decimated Ukraine's navy, as well as anti-ship missiles. These are all defensive capabilities. The goal of defensive weapons, as I said, is to make it costlier for Russia to launch another attack like it did in Debaltseve in February of 2015, or again in the town of Marinka in June of 2015. Russia must be denied the ability to attack Ukraine at will and with little or few consequences. Now let me spend a little bit of time, because there has been a lot of debate about this subject, and address some of the counter-arguments. The first counter-argument that I hear often is that Russia has escalation dominance. Well, yes, Russia can go all the way to the nuclear threshold and beyond, but Russia incurs costs for escalating. Opponents of defensive weapons trot out the same old tired arguments that the Kremlin doesn't care about casualties or the international reaction to its military operations. That is false. Boris Nemtsov and Denis Voronenkov were assassinated because of their efforts to expose what Russia's military was doing in Ukraine. The Soldiers' Mothers NGO in Russia was silenced as a result of its work exposing this issue. And the information on the war in Ukraine has been policed by the Russian intelligence services and effectively shut down. Russia cares about the costs, and defensive weapons would make it much costlier to launch an offensive operation. That is the bottom line. The second argument that we hear from opponents of this endeavor is that European unity on sanctions would evaporate if we were to provide defensive weapons. I believe nothing is further from the truth. Chancellor Merkel's opposition to providing weapons is often cited, but Merkel and other European leaders have consistently said that they would not oppose the U.S. providing weapons to Ukraine. They would continue to back Ukraine, and they would continue to back the effort to impose sanctions on Russia for its aggression. Moreover, if Russia continues to shell civilians and stonewall the negotiations, as it has for the last several years, this degree of support from our European partners will only strengthen. Finally, if we, the United States of America, provide defensive weapons to Ukraine, I have no doubt many of our allies will follow suit, and they will not only follow suit, they will provide the sorts of Russian-made weapons and ammunition that the Ukrainian military actually uses on the battlefield. Finally, the third argument against is that somehow providing weapons to Ukraine is provocative. Let me tell you, defending one's sovereignty is not provocative. What provokes the Kremlin the most is weakness and lack of resolve. When the Kremlin senses that there is no willingness to defend territory, it exploits that opportunity. We need to stop that now. The bigger context here, in terms of providing weapons, is to create a more ready, capable fighting force in Ukraine. The transformation of the Ukrainian armed forces is key to Ukraine's defense and its sovereignty over the long run. So weapons are only one piece of the larger puzzle, although that's what I've stressed today. Additional appropriations for security assistance, as Deputy Prime Minister Klimpushtin-Sadze mentioned, is vital, and we need to increase, in fact, the training program, which is so transformational, that has been adopted in the Obama administration, and transform it from small unit tactics, essentially, to combined arms training. Russia's military assault on Ukraine has been opportunistic. If you look at the efforts to foster insurgencies in 2014, especially in the spring, in Kharkiv, in Mariupol, in Dnipro, they all failed because the local authorities were capable and ready to defend themselves. That is what we need to support going forward. We need to shift Russia's cost-benefit calculus so that it understands that the costs of aggression are greater than the benefits. Thank you.
Before moving it on to Roman, Ms. Capter would like to ask a few questions.
Thank you for who you are. And to select one, since Mike Carpenter just spoke, I had the opportunity to get to know him a little better on a trip to Ukraine during the swearing-in of President Poroshenko. And I'll share with Americans who are present, if you haven't heard this story, that as Vice President Biden led our delegation through the streets of Kyiv, behind every other country in the world, Serbia and Lithuania, everyone, the United States must have been at the end because it begins with a U. But when the American delegation turned the corner and they saw Vice President Biden, Senator McCain was there, and I was bringing up the rear from the House. The people of Ukraine who were gathered in the Capitol began to cheer. I have been in many places in my career, all across the world, and I have never experienced what I experienced that day. The entire crowd, as far as your eye could see, erupted in America, America, America. It resounded off the walls of the buildings, and I thought, oh, they didn't do it for any other country. Not a single other country, and there were many countries represented. It was an astounding experience. And I promised myself, anytime I came back to this country, and I was with an audience that would appreciate that story, I would tell it. And I know Mike Carpenter experienced that too. This is a country that wants to be free and needs our help. In that regard, let me ask Mike and any of the panelists, as we look toward the new administration and our efforts here in the Congress, how is it going, in your opinion, in terms of being able to provide that additional defensive capability? Secretary Mattis, in his very early part of his service in this new administration, traveled to Ukraine recently, obviously met with our new president. What is your sense of how this is proceeding? Congress has provided the funding for support to Ukraine and to NATO. So what is your view of the changing dynamics of providing this type of assistance? Who would like to embrace that?
Thank you, Congresswoman. Maybe I'll start and I'll turn it over to Ambassador Vershbow to talk a little bit about specifically the Minsk negotiations and the appointment of Ambassador Volker as a special envoy. I will just simply address the defensive armaments issue. My understanding, and of course I am now outside of government, but my understanding is that there is broad support from the Pentagon, from the State Department, and from the National Security Council for providing defensive armaments to Ukraine, essentially reversing the de facto arms embargo. However, the decision is now with the White House for them to sign off on. Do you want to talk a little bit about Minsk?
Yeah. On that, my understanding is the same, that the issue has not actually been sort of posed on President Trump's desk yet for a decision, but I think if the situation on the ground continues to remain volatile and there's no movement in the negotiations, I think the chances of a yes are increased. But I think it would be useful for the Congress, and particularly the Ukraine caucus, to be more clearly on the record in supporting that and laying out the case that we make in our task force report. I think Congress has helped, as I said at the beginning, by producing the sanctions bill. I think there was some concern at the beginning of the administration that there was a readiness to ease sanctions on the cheap and not based on the original conditionality. I think Congress's strong views on the need to maintain the conditionality, now reinforced through the sanctions bill, has actually strengthened the hand of the negotiators. But if progress is still lacking in the negotiations, defensive weapons, I think, add additional leverage to the hand of the negotiators.
I think that those gathered and those listening should know that several delegations from Congress, both House and Senate, have been traveling to Europe and to Ukraine to enforce, and this goes back, I was on a delegation led by Paul Cook of California back in March. We did not go to Ukraine, but we went to our NATO partners to reaffirm NATO and the importance of our support to NATO. Other delegations from the House and Senate are going to Ukraine, and to reinforce our commitment as a country, as the new administration gets its people in place and so forth and makes these major decisions. We appreciate that the President met with President Poroshenko very much, and that the national security team is reevaluating what is most important at this juncture in Ukraine. And we thank you all, and I took your message, Ambassador, to go back to our Ukrainian caucus and to help move decisions in the White House along. Does anyone else wish to comment?
We haven't touched yet on civil society and key reforms, anti-corruption related reforms. And I think, my only concern about is the balance of messaging, both on, I think we could do both, we should do both, which is provide the security, address security needs, but also address the reform needs. And I'm a little bit concerned, we had a ace in the hole, which was Vice President Biden, every time we face challenges on the ground in Ukraine on key reforms. There doesn't seem to be that key person. Kurt, I know, is out, Kurt Volker, and I have a great deal of respect for him, but I'm seeing a little bit of change in terms of messaging, and partially because I think it's correct on the security side, but the importance of, on the Ukrainian side, to keep the momentum on key reforms. And if they, that security part of it is critically important, which is you need democracy to have security. You need to have the economic reforms to have security. And I just worry a little bit that we don't have the ace in the hole, and that the thinking on reforms that existed in the previous administration in this one. So I'm just urging that we keep that message intact. And within the sanctions bill, it actually included that congressional message on the continuation and needs to support the resiliency of countries like Ukraine that are impacted by Russian aggression. So if I could just add that point.
Very important one, thank you.
And thank you for coming to this session. I would just like to add my voice to my colleagues in terms of not only the reform and the military assistance, but a key to success in the future is economic assistance for Ukraine. And this is not only generic economic assistance for their economy, but also for the humanitarian issues that Ukraine faces right now. I think it's incumbent upon the Congress to take a serious look at increasing the amount of bilateral economic assistance that the United States provides, as well as doing a concerted effort on the multinational level to get more states as well as the international organizations to provide assistance to Ukraine.
Just to add to the notion on the humanitarian and development side in Ukraine, there's so many needs. Obviously, some of this is tied to reforms like land reform, which would make it possible to have major housing influx in Ukraine that would put a lot of the population back to work and offset one of the critical needs. 50,000 units of housing were destroyed in the war so far. We have 1.5 million people who are food insecure in the country, and yet humanitarian assistance has dropped this year. It's only $45 million from the entire international community, which is a pittance. Last year, the U.S. alone provided $49 million. And the winter is coming in Ukraine, unfortunately. And that means a lot of people don't have access to heating because of attacks on water lines and pumping stations. It means that children don't have warm enough clothes to go to school, particularly children who've been recently displaced. And so it's important that those needs be addressed and that we not have another winter of terror in Ukraine for the people who are displaced and subject to the effects of the war, the conflict.
Civil society, which drove Maidan and has pushed the reform process in Ukraine, is running up against deep resistance as oligarchic and traditional interests solidify their hold on and their interference in the political system. So support for civil society, which is the area I'm going to address eventually, is also critical.
I wanted to just mention one idea that is in a very rough form, that isn't so much on the defense side, but relative to some of the comments that have been made on humanitarian assistance. I've been thinking very hard about the question, who's feeding Ukraine today? The ordinary people of Ukraine, and have been meeting with agricultural professors and experts from Ukraine, and was given some figures that, if they're correct, are staggering. I was given a figure last week, 90% of the potatoes that are grown by women in their plots, in their villages, in the fields. 80% of the vegetables and fruits, and 60% of the hogs and dairy. I was actually not the food for export, but the food for internal consumption. So I started thinking in all the times that I've been to Ukraine, watching women who sell their small yields many times in local markets. Maybe you've seen some of these women yourselves in the Zhytny market in Kyiv holding mushrooms and berries, or looking at the little markets in Ternopil and in Lviv, places that one goes. And I started thinking, what could I do to help them? And so I've been thinking about mobilizing women first, and any men that want to help, looking toward next April, and whether we could do a Seeds of Hope campaign somehow, I don't know how, but where literally we would invite anyone who wanted to help us, parliamentarians, women parliamentarians from Ukraine and the European and Atlantic Union, former Peace Corps volunteers, women in our country who belong to associations who care about Ukraine, church groups, societies of all sorts. I don't know, it's just a thought. And I know when I donated seed to one oblast in Ukraine, how welcome that seed was a year ago and what it meant. And then to help work with these women agricultural professors in Ukraine to help to show women how some of these products can be brought forward to market through small enterprises. There are lots of professors who've now been trained in Western market methods, but this process is proceeding very slowly. And so I just mentioned a Seeds of Hope campaign during that particular vital season of April. Perhaps there's a way that a coalition could be formed, and if you have ideas on that front, our office is open. You're welcome to think with us on it. And I think an important, in terms of civic society, as two young women said to me last night who lead two very important Ukrainian American organizations, they said, you mean you're talking about help to our babushas? And they each brought up on their iPads pictures of their relatives in Ukraine. It was an astounding moment, and they both got tears in their eyes. It was very interesting. I thought, we're touching something really deep here, right? The unyielding spirit that exists across that country for survival and advancement. So I welcome your ideas. I welcome your thoughts on that. Our office is open all the time, and the Friends of Ukraine Network knows how to find us. Thank you so very much for your efforts.
Roman Popaduk will speak about, on behalf of the Economy and Energy Task Force.
I'd like to first of all recognize and thank the Ukraine Caucus in Congress for providing the facility for today and for also providing consistent support for Ukraine's agenda. We really appreciate everything that the Congress has been doing both on the House and Senate sides. I'd also like to recognize Nadia for putting this panel together and for making these panels possible in terms of providing recommendations for the Congress to consider. My co-chairs on this panel were Nadia, as well as Bob McConnell, Adrian Carmazan. So I'd like to thank them, as well as all the other members that gave an input on the recommendations that I'm about to discuss. Sandy and Michael gave a very succinct and to-the-point analysis of the military situation, one that I wholeheartedly endorse and the platform which I fully support. And then one thing that Michael mentioned in his comments was that this is part of a puzzle. The military issue is part of a puzzle. And he's absolutely correct. The other part of the puzzle I see is the economic side. You have to take a look at the economy in Ukraine to see what the Russians were all about in terms of trying to destabilize Ukraine. The destabilization of Ukraine not only involved a military situation, but also an economic situation. If you look at the facts that Ukraine and Russia were major trading partners, that in the wake of the war and the pressures that Russia exerted upon Ukraine, Ukraine's economy contracted greatly during the first few years. Inflation spiked to like 60%, that fell like 70% to the dollar. So you see the situation as well as the foreign reserves in Ukraine fell. So Ukraine was in a pretty sorry state throughout 2014, 2015. And the goal for the Russians was to make Ukraine a failed economic state, which would implode upon itself. The military pressure was part and parcel of that. But the goal was not only to make Ukraine a failed state, but also to raise the costs to the West in maintaining that state. So one way or the other, either by Ukraine falling apart on its own internally because of the economic pressures, or because the West at the same time refused to pay the price in terms of the economic support of Ukraine, the Russians felt that they would be able to gain the goals that they had set for themselves in terms of controlling Ukraine's future. Fortunately for the Ukrainians, fortunately for the United States, fortunately for the world, that strategy has failed. And Ukraine has actually rebounded in a very modest way due to its own resources as well as the help that the international community and the United States in particular has provided. If you look at the situation now, last year the economy grew about 2%. It's expected to grow another 2% this year, maybe 3% next year. The hryvnia has stabilized. Inflation has fallen to about 12%. Still high, but getting into the manageable range for the country. So the country is starting to stabilize, though slowly, on the economic level. That stabilization can only be maintained with continuous support from the international community. That help has been very instrumental. If you look at the IMF in terms of the tranches that the IMF has given, some like over $8 billion so far. And as an aside, one should note that those are four tranches that the Ukrainians have worked with. In other words, the Ukrainians have responded to the demands of the IMF during each tranche for the reforms that the IMF demanded, whether it was on energy or on budgetary issues. Prior to this, any IMF agreements that the Ukrainians had, the Ukrainians never got past the first tranche in terms of meeting the requirements. So this is big progress in terms of Ukraine's domestic decision-making regarding international assistance, as well as the ability of the international community to work with Ukraine to have Ukraine move forward on these goals. While Ukraine is moving forward, they do, and the international community has been very supportive. There are issues that are very pertinent to Ukraine itself. Ukraine does have its own future in its own hand to a great extent. But there are features that have impounded on Ukraine's ability to really get over the hump. And let me just lightly touch upon these very quickly. One of these, of course, is the old Soviet mentality holdover. That is still very much ingrained in the decision-making process. And you see that in the bureaucracy and in the corruption that takes place throughout the whole spectrum of society. The other thing is Ukraine has suffered on the economic side because of the world economic environment. You take the example of steel. It's a major exporter of steel. Ukraine has suffered because of the world fluctuation in prices. So the world economy has impacted. And of course, the war has impacted Ukraine. The annexation of Crimea as well as the takeover of the Donbass region has cut deeply into Ukraine's industrial capabilities as well as its financial resources. These can be overcome to a great extent by financial assistance from the international community. But Ukraine has to also focus on making changes on its own. And the issue that I'm going to address right now is very simple. It's one that we've always heard. We can divide the issues into two parts: what the international community can do, particularly the United States, and what Ukraine needs to do. If you look on the first part, I think you all have the recommendations in front of you in the pamphlet form. One of the key recommendations, one I mentioned to Congresswoman Capter just before, was the need for a large multilateral infusion of money into Ukraine. And I think one of the recommendations we urge is that the United States take the lead in trying to devise a fund of $25 billion over 5 years investment credit for Ukraine to help Ukraine overcome a lot of the financial issues that it faces, as well as investment issues. Another part of the recommendations basically comes down to providing assistance to Ukraine and what I call the second part of the equation, what Ukraine can do for itself, and that is providing assistance for Ukraine to undertake steps and things that we've already heard about, but it's worth repeating again. The need for a transparent judiciary, judicial reform, very, very important. The need for Ukraine to revamp its pension format, which takes up about 25% of the public spending at this stage of the game. The need for Ukraine to address its health care situation, which is very costly, one of the most costliest ones in the EU. If you look at the EU, for example, Ukraine has one of the most costly health care packages in terms of percentage of GDP. The need for land privatization. We've been talking about land privatization forever, it seems, but there is a key need for land privatization to take place in Ukraine. Another step that Ukraine needs to take is really has to start moving forward on the issue of the state enterprises, of having them privatized. It's important for them to start moving into the private sector because that would attract a foreign investment. It would probably definitely would make them more efficient in terms of their productivity, et cetera. So these are steps that Ukraine can take on its own, but these are steps that the international community, and particularly the United States, can help with by providing economic assistance as well as by providing technical assistance in terms of the procedures that needs to be taken to achieve the goals in these categories. And why is this important? Obviously, it's important for the overall concept of stability for the country, but it's also very important in terms of attracting investment into Ukraine. I mentioned that Ukraine is on the road of making a comeback, very modest. We've seen an uptick in FDI in Ukraine. There is a great need for more foreign direct investment in the country. For that judiciary to take place, which would fight corruption, which obviously is a key point, that would the role of judiciary would send a signal to the foreign investment community that Ukraine is open for business in terms of its governance procedures as well as its transparency, all of which are very important. Business people are willing to take the business risk in any situation. What they're not willing to do is take the political risk, and that political risk still continues to exist in Ukraine. When you come and invest in Ukraine, you don't know how that process will unfold for you because you don't have an independent judiciary to which you can turn to get assistance if there's a legal issue. So judiciary, the fight against corruption, pension reform, health reform, all those, the privatization of land and the move toward the privatization of this state enterprise are all going to be very, very important. And I will give you a good example of how all this rolls into one package. Right now, there's a decision pending before OPEC regarding a major project in Ukraine. Ukraine has a lot of spent nuclear fuel from its nuclear facilities. That fuel is currently being sent to Russia to be processed. That costs the Ukrainians about $150 million a year. So there's a twofold problem for the Ukrainians. One is monetary, obviously. The second, of course, is they do not like to be tied to the Russians on this issue. So Ukraine is in the process of trying to develop a spent nuclear fuel facility in the Chernobyl zone. It's being located. And they need the money to get this going. And they've turned to U.S. sources for the funding. And Bank of America Merrill Lynch has been engaged for the last 2 or 3 years on this issue and is in the process of getting to the point where we'll be able to go to the capital markets for a $250 million capital markets raise. I'm mentioning this because once OPEC gives the political guarantees on this, and we expect it may take place over the next week, and Bank of America goes to the capital markets on this will send a very strong signal to the international community that Ukraine is starting to become open for business. This is going to be a key feature of signaling the investment community overseas. I have to be transparent. My firm, Morgan Lewis, has been involved in this, and I've been part of this process of trying to get this going for the Ukrainians. We're very hopeful that this will work out. It'll be, as I mentioned, a very strong signal for Ukraine and for the international community. But these are the kinds of things that the Ukrainians need. Now, I do have to, in true fashion, everything that's Ukrainian, it took about 3 years to get to this stage. It took about 3 years. The Ukrainians just didn't understand the business model that's necessary in the Western world in terms of due diligence, feasibility studies, and things of that nature. We're still not there, but we're 90% there. So there's a learning curve for the Ukrainians as well. Anyway, I'm sorry it took so much time, but I thought it was worthwhile just to outline some of these things for your consideration. Dawn?
To thank the Ukrainian Caucus for hosting this event and for Nadia McConnell and the U.S.-Ukraine Foundation for putting it together. It's been a wonderful opportunity to get to know the community of concern. And my area is the 3.8 million Ukrainians, which is a higher number than last year, who are in need of international humanitarian assistance. And the fact that the UN was trying to reach 1.6 million of those people and has raised only 23% of the funding it needed. So now we're facing winter, and what's going to happen to families who lack the ability to get fuel? It costs about $300 to buy coal or wood to get you through one winter in Ukraine. 560,000 IDPs have lost their registration. The government unilaterally canceled their registrations, and they have to go through a long bureaucratic process, which requires legal assistance to be able to get your benefits reinstated. And we're talking about $34 for an adult, for a child or a handicapped person. But that's enough to survive in Ukraine. And as so many families that I met said to me, we will survive, but we would like our government to be a little more responsive to our needs. The UN Children's Agency conducted a study of 50,000 children along the so-called line of contact, which is actually now the border between government-controlled area and the non-government controlled area. Those children face shortened school hours. 165 of the 400 school buildings have been damaged. Many of the teachers have left. Classrooms are poorly equipped. But one of the teachers told the UN that we had no difficulty getting the children to come to school if they physically can cross the checkpoints and if their parents are able to help them get here and if there's no shelling going on. And why are the children anxious to come to school? Because there's clean water that they can drink. It's a safe place. There's a place to play. And for many of them, it means lunch, school lunches. For some of the IDP families and some of the war-affected families, there is no school lunch because they don't have the money, and their children are ashamed, and they are ashamed to admit to the authorities that they would need to get a free lunch. And their stigma is just there is in schools systems in the United States. 1 in 5 of the families along the border have lost a job in that area, the 15 kilometers close to the border, which has further impoverished. Roman talked about the significant change in the economy and the fact that while the economy has had some growth, the devaluation and the rising costs, particularly of energy, which in part was to deal with the concerns of the IMF, and the rising costs of food. The Congresswoman talked about the amazing gardens that Ukrainian women, and I've seen them and tasted their fruits. The difficulty many of those women complained about was their markets used to be on the other side of the line of contact. And now they can't do that. They can't cross unless they get online at 4 o'clock in the morning and cross on one of the 5 crossing points. There's only one crossing point in Luhansk, and it's wooden and it's broken, and there's no water and there's no sanitary facilities, and yet you have to stand online for hours and hours. By the end of the summer, 1.2 million people had crossed those, made border crossings. Some crossed because their families are there, because the cemeteries, the churches, even the hospitals that they once used are on the other side of the border. Some cross, obviously, to see what's happening on the other side. Some were still able to work, though many jobs have been lost because of the nationalization of industry in the non-government controlled area by those authorities, and also by the blocking of the rail lines. So I wanted to tell you just 3 things that if you can remember. What's happening in Ukraine is that the war is affecting women and children and the elderly. 60% of the population that's urgently in need of humanitarian assistance is women and children. The elderly, because of their inability to get pensions to move around, the lack of transportation, particularly in the zones near the zone of conflict, the fact that facilities have been closed, that hospitals and health clinics have been damaged, that there is no public transport, that there is no local security, and the fact that some military units, despite of regulations, station themselves in civilian areas, station themselves near schools, which invites, obviously, attacks and shelling. Children who are subject to shelling spend, unfortunately, at school, spends time almost every week in shelters, in bomb shelters. They worry about their own future. They worry about their separated family members. Their fathers have gone off to work, or sometimes their mothers as well, and they're staying with grandparents. So the war means impoverishment, the war means insecurity, and the war means what's going to happen about the future of the 1 million children among the affected population and their ability to not only to survive, but to believe and to have hope in the future and to cherish the freedoms that we think are so important and which so many Ukrainians have lost their lives for. 1/3 of the civilian casualties in the war, which are over almost 2,500 people at this point, come from landmines and unexploded ordnance, or what's now called explosive remnants of war. 7,000 kilometers of land are now contaminated with those landmines and unexploded ordnance, which means they're not suitable for picnic. You can't go into the woods to gather wood. It's very dangerous. You can't picnic in the summer. You can't grow crops in that area without a lot of risks. So when you think about the needs in Ukraine, please don't forget those are the most desperately and needy parts of the population. As I said, international humanitarian assistance has dropped considerably. It's at $45 million at this point to the UN's appeal for certain kinds of programs, including efforts to do some rehabilitation work of demobilized soldiers and the wounded and civilians. That's a particular need that our task force was very concerned about, the psychosocial and physical needs of demobilized veterans and war victims, and the fact that Ukraine still lacks physical rehabilitation kinds of programs and psychosocial programs adequate to deal with those needs. I thank you very much for coming today, and I hope you won't forget about the people of Ukraine as the winter comes, and I hope you'll support the charities that you believe in and know that deliver assistance at very low costs to the people in need. A number of those groups are listed in our program, but also a number of Ukraine's amazing civil society, and more of those organizations are working in coordination with bilateral government programs and also with the United Nations. And I thank you very much for this opportunity to be here today. And as the people of Ukraine kept telling me, we will endure, but don't forget us.
I also just wanted to add, I'm a bit of a hybrid. I've worked on the humanitarian, the economic, and the democracy and governance side of support for Ukraine. Cliff will talk to all those, but I just want to add my word about the tremendous amount of success that the Ukrainian government has made over the last 3.5 years, and that's something that we should applaud. I also want to add there's a tremendous amount of work to be done, and Cliff highlighted, I think, one of the key concerns that we have here in Washington amongst those who support reform is a slowdown in reforms. The RADA is about to kick off, or it just kicked off in Ukraine. They have an agenda that includes much of what the ambassador said, focusing on everything from pension reform to land-related issues. Hopefully it will touch on election reform and other key issues, health care as well, health reform. But there's a lot that needs to be done. There's a lot of inertia, fatigue, maybe a little less focus by the international community on these key issues, and I urge the administration to keep pressing hard, but also put the Ukrainian government's feet to the fire to continue in these efforts, because it'll be critical in order to get the assistance, they have to prove that the reform efforts continue to move forward, and it's critical to their long-term security that they do that. I did want to just touch on the humanitarian assistance, and Don is correct, and I really want to plead that humanitarian assistance tends to, and I know from interagency debates, even within the administration, we all care deeply about it, but when resource levels for assistance start to drop or in question, the humanitarian assistance funding levels tend to drop as well. And it was always a struggle internally to make sure that we kept the funding levels high on the agenda. It was something that the Vice President, under his leadership and that of others in the past administration, really pushed hard. So I'm hopeful that the funding levels that are being reflected in the Senate and other appropriations bill reflect funding for humanitarian assistance. And please recall that this crisis is competing with a number globally, and it's really important to weigh in on humanitarian assistance and put it on the agenda, even asking, members of Congress asking for a briefing on humanitarian assistance would go a long way to supporting it as we have these discussions. Just two other things I want to point out. One is this overall funding level. We have some real opportunities with the upcoming UN sessions to push harder for meeting those UN-specific goals for resources in Ukraine. In fact, the UN just came out with some new figures that actually increase the number of Ukrainians vulnerable to 4 million, increasing the number of over 2 million of those who are directly in need. Unfortunately, a lot of people have following Ukraine think the recent ceasefires actually created a situation where it's been easier for internally displaced to receive the things that they need. That's not necessarily the case. And as winter comes, it will get more difficult. And Don laid out some of those immediate challenges. So getting the resources up, making sure they're there. The U.S. can play a much bigger leadership role in ensuring that humanitarian assistance levels are where they are. The other part is access. The non-government controlled areas are increasingly closed off. It's been a challenge for the last several years to ensure that those who are inside the non-government controlled areas are receiving the type of assistance that they need. Women, children, elderly, those who are most vulnerable are facing really difficult circumstances. Those that are in the battlefield, the ones that have, where military equipment is placed close to civilian locations, really is a dramatic problem. And the UN just yesterday had a press release focused on just the number of civilians who have been injured in the last, from May 16th to August 25th, the number of deaths, 25, the number of injuries, 135. They may sound like insignificant numbers. This is only over a couple of months during a period when it's supposed to be more calm than it's been. So that's important. I just want to impart one thing. As we look at the security and defensive support for Ukraine, just have to make sure that we remember that the potential for the increase, and this isn't, we don't know what exactly the reaction will be, but as that tension ratchets up, that the resources are there to address those who may be impacted by increase in violence when that occurs. And that doesn't have to be because we're providing defensive weapons. It could simply be a push on an offensive by the Russians. But it's something that we really need to keep in mind and plan for, not only for winter, but at any moment when conflict flares up. And we all know that the number of violations registered by the OSCE on a daily basis is extraordinary. So my main focus here is to urge that continued support. And the last point I'll make is that the recommendations here, and this is what I really appreciate about what has been done, is not only asking what we can do for Ukraine, but what the Ukrainians can do for themselves. And in this case, there's a number of key recommendations, really including the government beefing up its own capacity and capabilities to support the IDPs. I hope that when Ukrainian officials are here, that they also start including in their talking points the need to support the IDPs, but what they're doing. We should not forget that the number of citizens impacted will have a long-term impact on the future of Ukraine, of hearts and minds, of healing divisions and wounds, of addressing the psychological traumas that Don pointed out. Those are important as well, and the government also has to keep to its end of the bargain. Thank you.
Let me say, first of all, I agree with everything Don and Jonathan said. This is the fourth winter that displaced persons are experiencing. So it's an urgent need. I can tell you, when I worked in the embassy in Kyiv, I saw the difference our technical and humanitarian assistance made in helping the Ukrainians achieve successes. And to be clear, Ukraine has made significant progress in the last 3.5 years in stabilizing its economy, in implementing a whole range of reforms, including police reforms and security reforms. At the same time, it's had to exert efforts to repel Russian aggression and to manage this humanitarian crisis. Civil society played a very dynamic role, an enabling role, in the Maidan Revolution and in actually pushing for the reforms that were accomplished in the post-revolution period. Civil society is facing serious resistance now, deep resistance from the old Ukraine, which is reasserting and attempting to protect its interests in the economy through the political system. Our task force made a number of recommendations focused on democracy, civil society, media, educational development. I'm not going to try, we're almost out of time, I'm not going to try and elaborate all of them. I'm just going to mention a few. I think we need to continue to develop and strengthen reform-oriented national parties, political parties, and civil society. This is something that U.S.-based nonprofit organizations do for the most part, and they're very effective and they have a good track record. We need to support judicial reform. Roman mentioned that. But there are areas of judicial reform that we can continue to support, as well as various anti-corruption initiatives. Exchanges remain important, and exchange programs and technical assistance with the Ukrainian parliament in particular to build up its legislative capacity. We were instrumental in helping the Ukrainian parliament write an anti-corruption law and in many other pieces of legislation. That needs to be continued. Academic exchanges are also important. Professional, people-to-people exchanges. I think we need to be sure we're supporting the Voice of America as a crucial source of balanced and credible news and information, not just about U.S. foreign policy and domestic policy, but about internal developments in Ukraine as well. We do a lot, need to do more to help develop media in Ukraine. Media that's balanced, that's independent, through training of journalists, through training of training high-quality investigative journalism and such. I worked a little bit when I was in Ukraine on the process of decentralization. It's extremely important to empower local governments, not just to have responsibilities, but also to have the money they need, the resources they need to carry out initiatives locally. I was so impressed when I visited the Oblast of Chernivtsi to hear mayors say that out of everything that happened from Maidan, for them as local government people, the decentralization, devolution of financing, giving resources to the local government was extremely important to them. It was, for them, the most significant outcome of what's happening in terms of reform. They could respond to the needs of their local community. It wasn't dictated by central authorities from Kyiv. I think we need to also look, as we've talked about displaced persons, the areas of vulnerability, and those are areas near the line of conflict, as well, where we need to target our assistance. Ukraine, over 3.5 years, has shown that it's reformable. I think we need to think in terms of how we can increase our assistance to help them finish this job that they've started. And again, the accomplishments they've had have been substantial. Thank you, and thank Nadia for organizing this.
Perhaps we have a few minutes for Q&A. So with that, if you have any questions, if you could come to the standing mic, please, and identify yourself.
You know, I know the situation from both sides, living for a long time in Ukraine and having relatives in all spheres of life, including healthcare, military, and other places, other areas of society. So my thoughts about listening all this and everything is absolutely right that you said, but I think the main task is to align our efforts from both sides, because there is resilience from one side and another side, and it's a kind of misunderstanding of what should be done to move forward. So I think our efforts should be concentrated on building this trust and understanding. Thank you so much.
I want to thank our superb speakers for their insights, informative statements, and I want to thank you, the audience, for your patience and interest. Thank you very much. This briefing is adjourned.